General for the Danish Energy Agency from 2014 to 2018. Mr. Bake has held several key positions in other ministries like Head of Department in the Danish Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Then I'll introduce Mr. Rajneesh Sharma, Technology Director, Wind and Low Carbon Solutions, Equinor. Equinor, besides active globally in the renewable, is also known by its first floating offshore wind farm at High Wind in Scotland. I'm sure he'll have something to tell about that. Then I will introduce Mr. Atmanand, Director of National Institute of Ocean Technology. In our very brief and short journey of offshore so far, NIOT, that is National Institute of Ocean Technology, has been a key technology support provider in terms of geophysical surveys, geotechnical surveys, and other technical support. I'm sure he'll have lots of things to share with us. Then I have pleasure to introduce Mr. Morten Derholm, Global Senior Vice President of Marketing, Public Affairs and Communications, Vestas India. I'll introduce Mr. Raj Gopal, Principal Secretary, Energy and Petrochemical Departments, Government of Gujarat, India. Gujarat being the first state, Gujarat being the site where the first offshore wind farm of 1 gigawatt is coming up, and state has, as all of you are aware, that very positive and conducive atmosphere in industry and also renewable energy. That's the first priority amongst all developers. Then I'll introduce Mr. Ulrik Stridbeck, Vice President, Head of Regulatory Affairs, Ørsted Wind Power, Denmark. I think Mr. Tanti is unfortunately has to go out for some other pressing assignment. Last is Mr. Balraman, Director General, sorry, not last, Mr. Balraman, next is Mr. Balraman, Director General, National Institute of Wind Energy, or NIWE as we call it. NIWE has been a technical support for the ministry in terms of both wind and solar in its resource assessment and other assignments. Mr. Balraman will have details about where the other LiDARs are coming up and what are the potentials in other areas for offshore wind energy. Then I have pleasure to introduce Mr. Barry Robertson, Senior Business Development Manager, APAC Inogy Renewable at UK. So with this, I hand over the floor to Steve Sawyer. Please continue.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Welcome to this session. We're all very excited about offshore wind in India. We weren't always very excited about it. I think when we first started to work on it about 5 years ago, and people looked at the prices in Europe and said it's going to be a long time before we have offshore in India. With the developments over the past few years, all that has changed. And thank you to the Ministry and to Joint Secretary Yadav for hosting this session here. We think offshore has a very bright future in India, but we need to get it right. And as a company as a country that pioneered the offshore sector with the first wind farm at Vindeby in Denmark in 1991, we're going to hear first from Mr. Morten Beck to reflect a bit on the Danish experiences and what they got right and what they didn't. So the floor is yours, sir.
Well, thank you, Steve, and fellow panelists and distinguished guests. First of all, a warm thank you to CII and the Ministry for the Indian Ministry for New and Renewable Energy for inviting me here. I'm very pleased to share our experience in Denmark with renewables and in particular with offshore wind. And flying here, I was already knew about the Indian INDC within the Paris Agreement framework, which is ambitious, and I congratulate you on this. But I didn't know about your offshore targets. And I was quite stunned with your target of 30 gigawatt of offshore already in 2030. That's quite a target. That's quite immense. We've come a long way in Denmark in terms of offshore wind, as Steve said, reflecting back to Vindeby, the first project, 5 megawatt, a small project. Today, we're running more than 1 gigawatt and have political ambitions for a tripling of that within a few years and even more. But India has even more impressive goals. And so the question is, how do you get there? And that, I guess, is what we are going to discuss today. I want to say first that, and this is important, and Steve also alluded to this, prices have come down quite dramatically. So what we see in Denmark now is that levelized costs of renewable energy, levelized costs of offshore wind are actually lower now than that of new coal. Decades of trial and error have taught us how to get there. And I will reflect a little bit on the key things that we've learned in Denmark. We can come back to a lot of the details. I think we've progressed along at least 3 avenues. First of all, location. Secondly, marketization. And thirdly, integration. So if we start with location, and realtors really get this right, location, location, location. Spatial planning is an important factor to get the location right. Identifying the best wind resources is a crucial first step, but we need to take other things into consideration as well when planning offshore. We have to avoid building wind farms near environmentally fragile areas, shipping lanes, and military installations. Marketization. To get the price of offshore wind down, it's pivotal to design a flexible framework for tenders. And flexibility comes in many forms and shapes, and we can get further into that later on. But from 2010 to 2016, the prices of offshore wind tenders in Denmark fell from 141 euro per megawatt hour to 49.9 euro per megawatt hour. So our approach is to de-risk the market for developers by taking a wide range of actions. Namely, the TSO develops the potential sites for wind farms and is responsible for environmental impact assessments. We let the TSO pay for and construct, so far, the grid connections. We have a fixed feed-in tariff, a contract for difference for 50,000 full load hours. We give offshore wind priority access to the grid. We have a one-stop shop for developers in regulatory affairs, and we let the lowest price per kilowatt hour determine the outcome of the tender. Finally, integration. To start out, it's necessary to do comprehensive energy planning to ensure balance in the electricity system. Another important factor is to ensure that the existing power plants are sufficiently flexible and can increase and decrease production as the wind blows, so to speak. And finally, Denmark is part of the regional Northern European energy spot market, Nord Pool. It ensures efficient and transparent trade of electricity between 13 countries and enable us to trade surplus renewable energy with surrounding countries. I want to keep this brief, so let me just close by sharing with you what I consider to be key lessons from the Danish offshore wind development. Firstly, carry out a thorough screening and planning process before designating areas for large-scale wind projects. Secondly, create a general framework for environmental impact assessments for large-scale wind projects to ensure environmental sustainability. Thirdly, it's crucial to have a one-stop shop for developers, investors, planners, and contractors. It cuts unnecessary red tape by providing a single government entry point. So those should be my closing remarks, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Morten. Vice Minister. That's a lot to digest. 25 years or 27 years worth of experience in the sector. I'd like to ask now Dr. Balaraman to reflect on, as the nodal agency for offshore wind development in India, what are the challenges that you face at present?
Thanks, Steve. So good afternoon. So thank you, panelists, to be here. And being part of Navy, we are more willing to listen from you what exactly you wanted for technical de-risking. And moving forward, at Navy, being a technical arm of the ministry, we are making a visibility for the technical aspect of the offshore wind energy. Already, as been aware, we are having one LiDAR already placed in Gujarat coast, and another LiDAR by the private developer is already in place. And we are going for 5 more LiDARs to be placed both in Gujarat as well as the Tamil Nadu coast. So this is going to create a visibility of close to 10 to 20 gigawatts. So I'm taking a range of 20 to 20 because there are uncertainties are going to be there. So we are going to have visibility at least for 10 to 15 gigawatts will be available by next 3 to 4 years down the line, where you have a complete data of the wind resource, the WPDs, as well as with the innovative support, we are also doing the geophysical analysis of all the surfaces, and close to, we are trying to talk about 5,000 square kilometers area. And also, we already started the geotechnical investigation in one of the locations in Gujarat, and additional 3 to 4 locations we are going to identify in Gujarat and in Tamil Nadu, so that we are going to create a visibility, as I said you, in the next 2 to 3 years down the line, to have all the information what is needed for this. And in addition, we are willing to listen from the experts here and what are the other aspects you need for technical de-risking, so that we can take it forward and we can make all the information available for the bidders to take forward. So this is what I want to share with you now. So I wait for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We'll have a lot more questions for you coming back. Now, Ulrich, there you are. You can speak from your chair, you can speak from the podium, whatever's more comfortable for you. It doesn't matter. We'll save time walking back and forth. Ulrich is representing the company that has more offshore wind in the water than any other by a long, long way. And how did you get there, and how do you get your prices, and what are your plans for India?
Thank you, Steve. Can you hear me? You're nodding. Thank you, Steve. Thank you to the organizers, Joint Secretary Yadav, for inviting me, for inviting us to this very important conference. And Steve, you mentioned our role in the offshore wind industry. We have constructed 6 gigawatt now, and we have another 3.8 gigawatt under construction. And we are where we are basically because we see, and I think we can now conclude also, that offshore wind power is indeed one of the shooting stars in the renewable energy sector. And it is a shooting star because of the sweet combination of very determined policymaking in key countries around the North Sea, industry commitment, and fairly brutal competition between many of us guys sitting up here. And we now have offshore wind becoming competitive with the conventional technologies. There is a strong clarity, particularly in Europe, for the pipeline throughout the next decade, driving cost reductions even further. So this is where we are. That's the industry that we are talking about. The very, very interesting, I think, for India is that we are now seeing the first industrial scale projects being committed outside of Europe. In Massachusetts, in the east coast of the US, in Taiwan, and looking at what they have been doing, they have been setting out very clear targets, very ambitious targets in their foresighted policymaking. They have entered into a process of great collaboration, great transparency with the industry in getting the regulatory framework right. And the offshore wind in new and emerging markets will have some catch up to do, but I think we have all been surprised about the speed that these new markets indeed seem to be catching up with. So also very, very promising for India. And we do, Ørsted, see great potential for offshore wind power in India. We do believe that offshore wind power can become competitive with coal-fired power. We think India needs the energy. And India, the Indian government, Indian policymakers have definitely also, in our view, gotten this off on exactly the right way by setting clear targets that can drive the investments in the supply chain, attracting developers here. So final remark maybe in that is that keeping on providing transparency, keeping on providing clarity, and allowing some patience to both for the Indian official side and for us developers and the industry to do our analysis, to understand what's going on and prepare our proposals. That would be what we hope will take place going on now. Thank you.
Thanks, Ulrich. While Niwe will be handling the technical side of things from wind, the oceans are an important, and the seabed are critical factors to take into account when developing this industry. And we're very pleased to have the director of NAOT, the National Institute for Ocean Technology, here, Dr. Atmanand. So what role are you going to play, sir, and what has been your interface so far with the developers, and how do you see the future of offshore in India?
Thank you, Steve. Thanks to the organizers for giving me an opportunity to be here and to talk about how our institute, as the National Institute of Ocean Technology, or rather the ocean part, plays a role in this offshore wind. I'm happy to say that our institute has been working in various forms of ocean energy, like ocean thermal energy conversion, wave energy, ocean currents, etc. And the new entrant is the offshore wind. And you know that the quality of energy, all these things are very well known, and now India is having a national offshore wind energy policy is being framed up, so that we have the ambitious target of 5 gigawatt by 2022 and 30 gigawatt by 2030 is met. So we, along with our sister institute, that is INCOIS, Indian National Center for Ocean Information Services, we have done a lot of wind assessments from the satellite wind data, which has been reanalyzed, and we have got data buoys in the ocean which measure the ocean parameters like the wind direction, currents, etc., and is validated. And we have found that the potential sites which are available in India are in Gujarat and Tamil Nadu. And after this assessment has been done, two agencies, one is Suzlon, has requested us to set up a LIDAR at Gulf of Kutch, and Niwe has requested us to do it at Gulf of Cambodge. And the main factor which I want to indicate here is that we found that about 8.3 meters per second at 20 meter elevation has been observed at Cambodge. Now the main issue in India is setting up of these offshore platforms. Perhaps we have to look at it slightly in a different way. India being a country with not lot of offshore installations other than what ONGC and Reliance does for the oil industry, we don't have much spread of offshore resources to set up these plants in the sea. Unlike developed countries which they have got the systems in place. So we have to depend heavily on countries, neighboring countries, in order to set up these plants. And the capex and the opex, if you see opex, of course, it's quite less in this case, but capex is going to be quite high. Let us divide that into the cost per se of the of the system, which is maybe same in the European countries and here. But if you want to set up the marine spread, cost is quite high. So this has to be reduced in order to make it more economically viable, for which we have done a lot of work to set up or rather train the Indian industry. For example, the work done for Nive as far as offshore investigations have been concerned to take up the platform of LIDAR, both for Nive and Suzlon. We had trained an offshore person who could do it in that particular location with much less cost than if we had to hire somebody from abroad. You know, the condition there is very treacherous. The currents are quite high, and you know, any smaller vessel which goes there, the currents are so high that instead of moving it forward, even with the full power, it will go backwards. But if you have a larger vessel, if you want to do, the depths, it's quite shallow, and it may get grounded. So there are a lot of conflicting requirements. Unfortunately, the organizers said that I should not have any presentation for that matter in this session, so I could have shown all these things through a video, but that's not possible. So I just want to tell you that these are some of the challenges which we have in setting up offshore plants in this part of the world, and maybe other aspects we will discuss during the course of these discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you, sir. I note that your office is very close by the Niue office in Chennai, so a lot of you will be going back and forth and back and forth. But the spotlight now is really in Gujarat, and we're pleased to have Principal Secretary for Energy from Gujarat, who we ran through the ringer last week in Hamburg, but now it's his turn to talk about the opportunities and challenges, but also what he needs from the central government. Dr. Gopal.
Yeah. So looking at the advantages which the offshore energy would bring to India, they are fairly evident. We can talk first about the advantages to the power sector per se. We all know that the quality of offshore wind energy is much better than the onshore one. And then you have the flexibility of locating these wind parks close to the load centers. Let's say all our big cities or where we have industrial hubs, we can have offshore wind energy parks over there. So that would prevent grid congestion to some extent and also reduce transmission cost. So this is one direct advantage which would be there available for the power sector per se. And also as such, most of the better onshore wind sites are now getting saturated. So we have to move offshore. Talking about the challenges, I would like to take a rather long-term view of the challenge, because the idea is how to make it sustainable in the long run. I would look at offshore wind energy as a subset of renewable energy, solar and wind. They're all intermittent. In the long run, considering that there's zero fuel cost, it would be impossible to stop injection of solar and wind energy. And as a nation, we are committed to it. With more and more of intermittent energy flowing into our grids, the challenge would be how to balance the grid and how to meet peak demand situations. And for that, the answer would lie certainly only in one solution. That would be storage. So eventually we'll have to think about storage very, very seriously, because it would make ample rational sense that when wind power or solar power is cheaply available abundantly, then you simply have to store it. We would go in for, in the long run, grid level storage batteries, pumped hydro, or for that matter, even power to gas. So all these things would come up, but in the long run. Now, finally, the million-dollar question, how to bring down the levelized cost of energy, especially in the Indian context. I would expect the developers to collaborate with each other and to bring about synergy, because we have had a very successful European story. Since the turn of the century, you have been able to bring down LCOE by 20%, and mostly by improving the efficiency of it. So I welcome you to carry forward your great story on the Indian shores And I assure that there would be ample tailwinds and hardly any headwinds there. What we can do on the government side, on the regulation side, on the policy side is perhaps trying to de-link one aspect of it, and that is the transmission. If we treat transmission infrastructure as a separate asset class, we all know that you have three models, the generator-based and the developer-based, and I mean the TSO-based, and now the model which is obtaining now in UK, that is the offshore transmission owner model, the OFTO model. So I would certainly advocate that we can go in for an OFTO model here, and then the transmission owner doesn't have the risk of generation, would get paid from the transmission utility, and it would certainly take away the cost, from the cost which will go into the project as such. So this model you can consider. I can recommend to my government, to the regulator, and to the MNRE. So in brief, these are my basic views in short, and I would look forward to your questions if you have any. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gopal, and I'm sure we'll come back to you on specific questions in relation to Gujarat and the first tender. But now, hear from the only OEM on the panel. It is. It wasn't supposed to be, but Morten Deerholm, Senior Vice President from Vestas, which is the second largest offshore turbine supplier now, and has the first double-digit turbine on the market.
Thank you, and that is correct. Thank you for mentioning the first 10 megawatt turbine ever in the industry. Very proud to have released that last week. And although we are second ranked in terms of market share at the moment, I think it's important to remember that we pioneered this industry and we have a lot of experience in building huge offshore turbines. So enough with the commercials on the company. I want to start a little bit different than where the others started, because I have reflected a little bit over the last couple of days I've been here, and I'm talking on behalf of my industry peers and colleagues, that when we hear the Indian government ambitions, we have a tendency to immediately say, oh, that's tough, or maybe that's a little bit too fast, or we should be cautious. I think the correct response should be, let's applaud a government that actually sets the bar that high and has the bravery to put targets that are that ambitious in that amount of time. So I just want to put that very straight as from the industry perspective. I wish there were more governments like the Indian government that dared do that. And I think we should all be proud that we have such a government doing that. So that's out of my head. The other thing I want to say, when all that is said, I actually do agree with Steve in what he says in the beginning. Let's do it right. Let's do this right. Because it's important to remember that offshore is not onshore, right? We are building massive turbines here. 250 meter high, 500 ton, 10 megawatt monsters. And we cannot just copy paste the supply chain we have in India and then just pretend that we can quickly move towards introducing these new products in this market without pain. It's going to take a lot of investments. And although I understand the excitement of Europe for 5 US cents kilowatt hour offshore electricity, let's not get too overexcited and believe that we can instantly go to 5 US cents in the Indian market. We need to invest heavily in machinery, logistics, transports, jackups, piles, all kinds of things. It's a massive undertaking in terms of investments. And so we have to cater for that in the first auctions that will come up here. And that has to be reflected in the price. There has to be some form of baseline that we as investors can see a meaningful perspective in before we start putting all that investments into the ground. And I bet you it will go fast. The minute we've started, and the European example shows that, the minute we've started doing that, and you have enough transparency in your tenders, and you have enough competition going in there, then prices will drastically come down. Because then we've taken all the initial investments, and we're ready to move to that next phase that we're seeing in Europe now. It will go very fast. But I just want to put that caution out here in the beginning. Let's not believe that we can copy-paste the European example in the first auction. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Morten. Couldn't have said it better myself. And another sort of pioneering thing that's going on in the sector at the moment is floating offshore, which is the next evolution. And we're fortunate to have Rajneesh Sharma here.
Running in many parts of the world, there was nothing to prove in India. So we thought, because pilot would have taken, let's say, 5 more years, and we would have, let's say, lost these years. So we started with 1 gigawatt project. 5 more lidars will be coming, 2 in Gujarat waters and 3 in Tamil Nadu waters shortly. So we expect 2 gigawatt of, at least 2 gigawatt, if not more, of further projects off Gujarat coast. Gujarat has good appetite, and Maharashtra being nearby, 2 gigawatt would not be a big project. So 2 more gigawatt of projects in Gujarat and 3 more in Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu, again, if I understand correctly, has wind quality of North Sea.
We can supply, but the issue for me is exactly what was just said, which I think is the correct approach, namely go big as soon as you can and make sure that there is a very visible, transparent pipeline now saying a gigawatt tender, and then the next year I know there's going to be another gigawatt, and then another gigawatt, another gigawatt. That conversation changes completely for the investors. So I think it's the right approach. Yeah.
Rajneesh.
Yes, so your first question, Steve, about design parameters are very essential to make best possible concept. Not only desktop, but core design parameters like meta-ocean, geotechnical and geophysical data is very essential. But not only that, but there should also be time enough from getting the data to process towards the bid, to optimize the concept, be able to and have time to talk to supply chain, to push the cost and to optimize the concept. That's also, that timeline is also very important. And when it comes to turbine, that's an interesting topic, of course. The epicenter of innovation and technology development of offshore wind turbines has been in Europe. So it is, as mentioned, a roadmap is important to justify investments, to tailor make a wind turbine for the low wind conditions like in Gujarat.
Yeah, they say low wind conditions, but my experience is the closer you look, the better it gets. And I've already had some informal discussions which indicate that the initial readings at least are higher than those indicated in the mesoscale maps. How much, I don't know. And as the Joint Secretary mentioned, Tamil Nadu is, well, I think it's like North Sea in terms of velocity, but I think it's probably the conditions are much, much easier in general than you'd find in the North Sea. So, but I do think, as we've seen as we're beginning to see in Taiwan now, with the developments there, and like we saw with the first big developments in South America and in Africa, all these machines that were developed for the European environment need in some cases, significant modifications to deal with things like temperature, salinity, humidity, ocean state. Do they need to be typhoon-proof or not? Combat, maybe not, but maybe they do. I don't know. These are all things that need to be considered. And my guess is that you will come up with a West Coast Indian configuration and an East Coast Indian configuration, but I realize you can't say that now. Dr. Balaraman, will you be certifying all of the offshore turbines as you do for the onshore turbines as well at NIWE?
Yeah, the process of recognizing the turbines regarding the safety part of it and checking on whatever certificates being obtained, yeah, definitely yes, because we want to be very sure about the quality of turbines what get installed in the country. And in particular, because since we are going for offshore territory, so it is going to be more stringent because standards are available. We are not trying to inspect it very clearly, but we want to make sure that the turbines what is getting installed is a right type of turbines.
And will you have a test facility in Chennai or?
Yeah, we are trying to create a natural research and test facility. Okay, it's a near-shore facility. So where we are near to the Rameshwaram, the Dhanushkodi coast, which is a very promising to be a national test center. So those who want to test on Indian condition, they are definitely welcome. So we are trying to create. In the last DC meeting, we got approved. So we're waiting the ministry's clearance part of it, and we're moving forward on this test facility.
Okay, Morten, you and some of the other guys need to get some of your machines down in those test fields.
Yeah.
Okay. What time is it? It's 3:30. Okay, we have 30 minutes. I would like to then discuss the other big piece, as Barry mentioned, because normally when you look at an onshore project, 65% of your capital cost at least is the turbine, and the balance of plant is 35, whereas the numbers will vary, but more or less for offshore, you turn that on its head, where the turbine is 30, 25, 30, 35%. And it's primarily the foundations and the electrical and the balance of plant. Where are we going to get these foundations? Well, first we need to know enough about the bottom to know what kind of foundations we need. But are we going to start building them in India? We're going to bring them from the Middle East? Bringing them from Europe is going to be outrageously expensive. Where are we going to build these foundations for the first project? Anybody know? Barry.
That's a terrific question. I wish I had the answer. No, it's very true. Although there is, like I said, a global industry, a global demand for offshore wind, these type of questions are getting asked in every market. Taiwan especially, like I said, it's probably a little bit more advanced in its market than here, but it's approaching these issues too. It doesn't have the same manufacturing capability that likes of India does, but this is a very specialised type of manufacture. So it's more likely to come from the Middle East, I would think, or possibly Europe. Admittedly, that would give a lot of price, driving the wrong way, especially if there is any sort of major import tariffs put on steel. That could be a very big drawback into getting this first offshore wind plant underway.
Yeah, I'm sure there are Indian companies that could make them, but Joint Secretary?
Of course, I mean, the final decision where to get these foundations will rest on the winner. But I believe in the Wind report, it has been identified that L&T facility at Hazira, which is a reasonable size coast, can fabricate all the foundations.
Yeah, Dr. Abmanand.
We partially, Joint Secretary has answered what I wanted to tell, is that definitely Indian industry is capable of doing it. Perhaps it has not done something of this type, but definitely the capability exists. And as he said, L&T is one of the good contenders or bidders who will be able to do it. And we at NIOT is committed to work with NIWE, especially our ministry is committed to work with MNRE in the area of offshore wind, and we are there to support all the activities specifically related to offshore foundations, geotechnical investigations, anything which is related to the sea part. Thank you.
Yeah, I have no doubt whatsoever that there are Indian companies more than capable of making all this stuff. The question is to get them to do it. I mean, it's the same in the onshore, where we're still importing parts. Simply we're going to get them cheaper than Europe because we haven't figured out a way to incentivize Indian manufacturers to make them to the standards that are required for the onshore industry. So we need to do that as well, somehow, which is over to you, sir, and your colleagues in government to figure out how to do that. But I think that's the most important thing you can do from our perspective, I think, is pipeline, 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 and then let the market do its thing. But Rajneesh.
Just one comment or question. I think there is a capability and also engineering competency widely in India. So in the future, there is of course potential to fabricate and manufacture the foundations here and also the towers. But I think the supply chain also needs some incentives as discussed. So my question is, like in oil and gas, there has been some exemptions on tax, lower tax, GST. Is also that possible or thought about for the offshore wind?
I don't think that's a question to me. Taxes, import taxes, GST, etc., etc.
I will try to give an indirect answer because I don't hold fort for the Ministry of Finance. But considering the general atmosphere, both major sectors, there are wind and solar, both has moved to a bidding model. I think small hydros, minor sector is still on feed-in tariff, but by and large, the renewable industry or renewable sector in India has moved from feed-in to bidding route. Now, in bidding route, I'll say very marked financial assistance, they don't exist overall. I mean, this is more structurally, I say, because the bidder is expected to take all risks into consideration and give his best. That's the feeling of the Ministry of Finance. I mean, because we keep interacting with them. Nevertheless, I believe the financial incentives of accelerated depreciation and other similar incentives for onshore will continue to be available for offshore sector also.
Okay. Yeah, you made reference to the FOWIN project, and as many of you know, we worked for 4 years to do a lot of the preliminary work. All that data is available online. Currently, at the moment, it was sponsored by the European Union largely, but also with the support of Renew Power and GPCL. And there's an ongoing project, the first offshore wind project in India, conducted by the FOPI coalition. And we were supposed to have a speaker from FOPI today, but we don't. He couldn't make it because of visa, but I know Gabriel Zatuni is here in the front row. Would like to give him an opportunity to ask a question and B, tell us about the geotechnical work you're doing in the Gulf of Combat at the moment, which will be critical information for these gentlemen to put their bid together. So I don't know what the arrangement for roving microphones is, but I will pass mine over if there isn't one. Oh, there's one right there. And then Dilipet, I think, had a question. Gabriel.
Yes. Thank you, Steve. With regards to the geophysical status, we have completed geophysical survey in the FOPI project area, which, as I understand, is going to be complemented by NIOT, surrounding an area of 400 square kilometers. We also understand that there will be some boreholes in the project area and also in the LiDAR positions, and we are going to be providing advisory on the technical specifications for these boreholes. So that's a little bit on the geophysical and the geotechnical. We have found mostly soft silty clay sand on the top sediments, 10 to 19 meters depth on the FOPI area, but it's also my understanding that there can be different conditions across Zone B and Zone A as well. And if I can have a question, then I will address one to Mr. Gopal. You have mentioned different asset classes on the electrical infrastructure and on the wind farm. And my question is there any intention in the tender to split the costs or the award or the pricing for these two components, those being wind farm and electrical export infrastructure, including substation?
I have no hesitation in sharing with you that I had a brief conversation with Mr. Yadav a short while ago, and I told you that I got an opportunity recently in Hamburg to attend a global level seminar, specifically on offshore wind energy, and I received a number of inputs, which I would like to pass on even formally to the MNRE. And this certainly is going to be a suggestion from my side. And we would need regulatory approval for that, which I hope we can try for, and we should be getting it also, perhaps.
Mr. Dilip Nigam, MNRE.
I'm Dilip Nigam from MNRE.
Dilip?
The first thing I would like to say that yes, I fully agree that offshore is totally different than onshore. And I agree what Morten said, that it's not like, it's not copy and paste business. We have to do a lot of homework. And as Mr. Yadav said, that we have done a lot of homework. So we have talked about resource assessment, various clearances, etc., geotechnical, geophysical. I want to know from the experts, the lot of infrastructural requirement, development requirement at the port. So how has it gone in the European countries? Whether the port infrastructure development has to be created by government or the developer who will come to India after bidding, he will have to do. And if it is so, then could you please elaborate that what are those infrastructural requirements at port which have to be taken care by the government? Second, I just want to mention about the GST thing, what you said. In GST era, there is no zero GST in any case, but renewable has been awarded the 5% GST slab. So all developmental things which will take place in renewable, whether it is offshore or onshore, will also come under that.
Yeah. Port question.
Until 2 years ago, since it was a good coincidence that I was in charge of the ports and the transport sector in Gujarat. And so the question on port facilities, and then I had an opportunity also of visiting some of the ports which have been specially designed in Germany to handle, the offshore wind energy components. And your view is absolutely right. The ports will need a lot of strengthening to begin with. They have to be modified, refurbished to handle, very specific vessels which are required, for installation of various components of WTG offshore. And we have, various kinds of ports. We have ports which are being operated by the private sector. And one port happens to be fairly close to where we have located the site which is planned now. And the representatives of this port were especially invited. They had an interaction with the representatives of various companies which had responded to the expression of interest of the MNRE. And so there is surplus facility available which can be very easily modified to suit the requirements of offshore wind energy for sure. And since it's an ongoing port, it won't need any very special, clearances, etc. Clearances are all there. They have backup land available also. So that comes to me as a default choice. But otherwise, if the developer is interested in having a greenfield port, that is also available very close in the proximity of where the park is being planned. And that can also be handed over to the developer, or even the Gujarat Maritime Board, which is the state-level organization which regulates develops the ports in Gujarat, would also not mind developing a special, so to say, energy port to handle these facilities. And in the backup plan, we can go in for all the fabrication facilities, which would essentially be required if we want to make, the cost of capex, if we want to reduce it. So opportunities are there, and resources are available, and they can be utilized for this.
Well, I can't speak for all of Europe, but the difficulties with the early stage offshore projects is that they were all one-offs, and with special arrangements for manufacturing, for transport, for vessels, for ports, and all the rest of it. And as things scaled up, obviously it became clear that it needed to industrialize and standardize. And we have now, 5 major offshore ports? You've got Bremerhaven, Eemshaven, Cuxhaven, Esbjerg in Denmark, and I guess Humberside is now becoming one in the UK, where the Siemens manufacturing is, that will supply, and I may have missed one or two, but they will supply the majority of both staging, construction, or initial fabrication, transport hubs for most of the European offshore wind farms. Now, that doesn't solve the whole problem, and it took a lot of trial and error and mistakes and all the rest of it to get there. And what we've suggested through the ports and infrastructure study that we did in the FOWIN project is you do it beforehand, and it sounds like Gujarat is well on its way to getting that issue sorted before it starts off. Tamil Nadu will be another sort of challenge, but we have at least another year. There are, it has the best winds in Tamil Nadu, but everything else is better organized in Gujarat. So we'll have to do a bit of mix and match in terms of how to get there. But no, and in China, same thing. They tried to do it all out of Shanghai for the whole coast for a while. Didn't even begin to work. The Chinese made not only every mistake that the Europeans made, but they invented some of their own. Special ones that could only be done in China. And you'll probably do that in India as well. But hopefully you don't have to make all the same European mistakes anyway. Yeah. Gentlemen.
Yeah.
Pragan.
Yeah, I'm Parag from Renew Power. My question is to Mr. Yadav and Dr. Balraman, and this is on behalf of all the developers who are very keenly following the entire offshore process. The first question is around the timelines. As we know that bidding documents are under draft, so it is a request from the industry that the adequate time between the PPA signing and the commissioning of the plant be given to all the developers, and we all believe it can't be less than 5 years. Though I understand you have a very strict target with you, you want to do the first 5 gigawatt by 2022, but as we all know, the PPAs can't be signed by mid of the next year, which is 2019, and less than 3 years, hardly any project can be built. We have studied the entire tender process in Netherlands, in UK, everywhere 5 years has been provided. In fact, in Germany, 8 years was provided. The second request is, this is something which we repeated in the Hamburg conference, where Mr. Rajgopal was there. So please don't cancel the bid after receiving the tariff numbers. We all know that it will be a surprising element. It will be much higher than what government is expecting. But this is not like onshore wind and solar, which Indian government is pretty habitual about cancelling them. So here it requires a lot of effort, a lot of cost goes away in conducting the foundation studies and multiple other stuff. So please be aware and be prepared for a higher tariff. You can mention that in the bid document as a ceiling tariff, and accordingly we can decide to bid and not to bid. But please don't cancel the bids post conducting it. That would be a very bad start for the offshore industry in India. Thanks, sir.
You want to respond, sir?
Yeah. I think the question was for me, so I'll try to respond. So despite the pressures, I'm moving cautiously, and I can say that I've been fairly successful in that. So we'll continue moving, hopefully in the right direction, and we'll take care of all the bidders' apprehensions and try to take those into account. Regarding specifically the timelines are concerned, I know that the standard timelines of 2 years after the PPA is signed is for the developed market. So it's not going to be the same for India. So we are going to consult you on the timelines. It will be more than the standard 2-year timeline, which I believe in the developed UK North Sea markets. It could be 3 years, it could be something like that. I mean, despite there are pressures, if we give 5 years, then there is a tendency, 5 years is less, and let's try to do it in 8 years. So it will be reasonable. It will not be bad, but there will be certain timelines. It will definitely not be the standard timelines for a developed market. It will be more than that. I think I've tried to give answer to your timeline question. Second is cancellation of bid. Sir, the couple of cancelled bids you're talking about are for the developed sectors. I mean, one, I can respond to one bid which was cancelled and partly respond to the second one which was solar. So these were different cases, and I'm sure, like if I talk specifically about the wind bid which was cancelled, this was undersubscribed, sir. There was no option. I'm sure, I don't know, theoretically there might be an auction, but if the bid is of 2000 megawatt and we get 1200 or 1000 megawatts, and naturally there was a subsequent bids. So these were in the circumstances where the bids were regular, and one particular bid which was undersubscribed because of certain perceptions about connectivity problems was cancelled and was taken over by the subsequent bid, which I'm sure you, I mean, a number of bidders participated and it was successfully done. Again, I said, sir, this is going to be higher than the normal market tariff for onshore bid. So we are ready for those. But then again, financial outgoes will have to be defined. We'll try to be as liberal as possible, but it cannot be very open-ended. I hope you understand that. I'll have to tell Ministry of Finance how much money I want for this. So this has to be defined. It cannot be no, let's see that, and because even 1 rupee differentiation is about 2,500 crore to 3,000 crore. It's a big money. So I'm sure with that perspective, but we are trying to trying to de-risk the project as much as possible, and definitely all this effort is not towards cancellation of the bid. I'm sure I've tried to set your apprehensions to rest, sir.
I'm just sitting here listening to a very commercial dialogue going on, and I'm looking at this from a regulatory and political perspective, and basically thinking there needs to be a physical supply chain built, obviously. For that to happen, there needs to be clear indications of, as there is in India, a willingness to build. And there needs, at the same time, to be management of political expectations, because this is going to be more expensive in the beginning, less expensive as you go forward. So that's very clear. I think a lot of this hinges on de-risking and making sure that investors have the right incentives to go into the market, right? And we have, and you say, don't copy the European mistakes. I'll probably frame it a little differently. Lessons learned, copy the lessons learned. I think what we've learned in terms of tendering is, and you alluded to that, Joint Secretary, is basically opening up the end of the tender process. So when you actually have to erect the turbine, right? The next project we're building in Denmark, we're going to start the tender process next year. It's going to be a window that ends in 2027. So that leaves a long window for constructors to build the actual park. And that, again, takes away risk. So that is one point. Another point is, in the tendering process, we have opted for a dialogue-based tendering process. So we will go into dialogue with anybody who wants to build on what their concerns are and how we can meet those, and be very transparent with everybody about how we can arrange a tender that meets as many competitors' requirements as possible. And so getting competition right. And so what I think, if you can manage political expectations in the sense of saying it's going to be more expensive in the beginning. So we'll not look at one project, we'll look at 5. We'll look at so many gigawatts. And then after that, we'll take a political decision as whether to opt in or out. I talked to the finance department as well as you. So I know that dialogue. So I think that might be one suggestion. And another suggestion would, again, be to go into this dialogue-based process with competitors. I think those would be reflections from my side.
Amar?
Yeah, hi. My name is Amar Varyawar from Vestas, and my question is for you, Yadav sir, and Mr. Rajgopal. Before I raise my question, I just wanted to touch upon my recent experience in offshore in Denmark. Recently, I visited SPR port, and I came to know that 10 years ago, on that port, there were around 5,000 boats which were there, and now you can't even find 5 boats there. I'm talking about the small boats. But then, the other side is that they have definitely given a lot of space on a lease purpose to different, the companies like Siemens Gamesa, Vestas, and so on and so forth, Vestas MHI. And they do pre-assembly at the port in order to save the cost, because then when you do actually installation in the sea, cost will be exuberantly high. So in order to save that much, they do a lot of pre-assembly activity at the port itself. My question to you, sir, that when you say that yes, a lot of ports development activities are undertaking right now, and sir has given 2 years time frame, after the PPA is signed, and we need to do something for the commissioning of the project. But sir, do you have any roadmap about how many ports we are going to develop, and by what time frame it will be done, so that it will be exactly in line with the tender which is coming out, first gigawatt soon, and then otherwise it will be definitely the clarity is needed by the developers, by the bidders at the time of bidding process. One example I'll tell you that I actually saw the big ship there which was used for uploading and loading of the blades, which are around 84-meter long. The cost of the ship, or the rental cost of the ship, was 150,000 euro per day. Similarly, there were special cranes used there, which were around 500 to 1,000 tons of capacity. And if you, disassemble the crane, around 150 trucks are required to transport that crane. I mean, I'm just talking about the scale of that entire process. And when you're talking about the port development strategy, are we talking about the timeline also along with that, so that we can match the tender, and so that everything fall in line for the smooth bidding process? Thank you.
See, port development and customization of the facilities which are required for handling offshore wind park components cannot precede, the award of a contract, because the contract has to happen first. First, the requirement has to originate, and after that, these facilities can be modified. And I have talked directly to the operators and owners of the port in question, like the private one, and they are more than confident. So I don't see that there would be any problem on that score.
Any further gentlemen in the front?
My question is supplement to Parag. One thing is, actually, if you see the regulations and kind of approval we may require for offshore are huge, and sometimes it may take years. For example, getting the approval from CRZ. So MNR is one of the project in 98-99. They haven't got the approval. I think that's in West Bengal. So they moved the project to 500 meter ahead, and they commissioned the project. And one of my project in 2007, I haven't got the approval from MOEF for continuous 2 years. So ultimately, I shifted the project. But in offshore, these CRZ regulations and other approvals are very mandatory, and if that these kind of critical approvals has been taken before the tendering, so it will help the bidders. Otherwise, that we have to set the timeline for 5 years or maybe 8 years or like that. And second thing is regarding the receivables. So we as an investor, we want that surety about the receivables. So who will be the ultimate purchaser for this the power? Ultimately, this power will be higher, and who will be going to guarantee that power on behalf of SECI or SECI and for the next 25 years? So it will build the confidence among the bidders.
The two questions I'll respond. One is about regulations, and specifically you spoke about the CRZ. As I said, structurally 2 levels of approvals or clearances are already defined. One is in principle approval for the area for development of offshore wind project of, let's say in this case, 1 gigawatt size, has already been taken from all agencies barring one, which is expected to, the remaining one is expected to come by let's say a week or so. So this in principle approval from all concerned, all possible guys have already been taken. The second becomes a project-specific approval, which further more information will be needed. And as I said, once somebody, all the major ministries are concerned, including the Ministry of Environment, they also come into the in-principle approval. Let's say Ministry of Home, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of External Affairs, Ministry of Environment. So once they give in-principle approval for development of an offshore project, I don't see any problem. I don't perceive any problem that why they should have problems in the stage 2 approvals. And this is my understanding. Again, to facilitate the stage 2 approvals, NIWE has been designated as the single point channelizing agency. So the developer need not go from office to office, from ministry to ministry. They only need to submit their papers to NIWE, who will then become as a communication to the remaining ministries. Regarding receivables is concerned, as I said, SECI will be the tendering agency, and SECI has been doing bidding both for wind and solar, and is well recognized, and that is considered as a lowest risk for both wind and solar. Most likely the receiver in this case is going to be the Gujarat government. The final things are being worked out. So that again, since it is one state who has extremely good reputation of making payments. Anyway, in this case, there's a separate payment security mechanism is there, and SECI's mechanism is already well defined. So all these combinations, I perceive the risks are pretty less. Gujarat as a final off-taker and SECI as a bidder. So I'm sure your receivable risks are also removed. Thank you.
Okay. Last question, Charles. You have
Hi. Thank you very much, Steve. I'm Charles Yates. I'm a finance consultant for Offshore Wind, and my question is for the Joint Secretary Yadav and Gopalji. I was very interested when Gopalji talked about the OFTO model, because as background, I've been deeply involved with that in the UK, where it's brought in about $3 billion of additional capital, not from developers, but from pension funds and life insurance companies, and it's driven down the costs of the transmission assets by someone who really focuses on them. So my question is, I think it's a great idea that could well help India and make power projects offshore more affordable. What are the next steps to further develop the idea and to take it forward?
I think I did respond to it earlier that formally my suggestions would go to the MNRE, and then they'll have to take it up for, if they are convinced of the utility of this kind of a provision, they can make it part of the RFP, and then the regulatory approval would be required. So this would be how we proceed in this matter.
So, lobby your central government. I don't know if do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, if I understand the question right, this is about financing of a big project.
Financing of the grid component.
Yeah. Offshore transmission grid. Yeah, we had during the 2-day deliberations with the expression of interest, we'd spoken to all the, this was a standard question which we raised, whether you'd like to have a separate transmission provider or you'd like to do transmission yourself. Because typically, and that the problem we are facing in renewables, that project completion time of renewable, be it solar or wind, is far less than the project completion time of the transmission. So transmission typically takes about 3 years, whereas a solar project can come and about 1.5 years. Similarly, wind project can also, at least onshore wind project can also come. So there's clearly a time gap between the two. And I'm sure for offshore also the case is going to be the similar. Most of the participants that replied that they'll be happy to take care of the transmission themselves. Taking cue from that, we're trying to club the two projects and give it to one bidder only, so that there are no coordination issues in these two projects, the transmission and the till shore, transmission till shore. From shoreline, the substation at the shore will take care of that.
Good. Well, formally speaking, we're out of time. I'd like to ask if any of the panelists have any last points they would like to make to wrap it up. We could go on here for several hours, but many of us have to go to the next session. So, anything else? Thanks very much. Thank you, Joint Secretary, for organizing this session. And we know you're under a lot of pressure, and we're trying to make it. We're all trying to work together to make it work, and I think we've made some progress today. And let's carry on. Thanks, Barry, Ulrich, and all. And thank you for hanging in there. And I hope we answered all your questions. But if not, we'll be here all week. Thank you. And we have presents and pictures and things.